Maybe you could speak a little more about the violence that was, the American workers faced in forming unions and different things. Lucy Parsons, in the aftermath of Haymarket, this is a quote from her, she said, "A reign of terror swept over Chicago, and the organized bandits and conscienceless brigands of capital suspended the only papers which would give the side of those who they cram into prison cells. They have invaded homes of everyone who's ever known to have raised a voice or sympathized with those who have aught to say against the present system of robbery and oppression. They have invaded their homes and subjected them and their families to indignities that must be seen to be believed." Could you speak to the violence of the American labor movement in comparison to, say, our European counterparts?
Well, what she described continued. I mean, there was really significant labor activism in the late 19th century. Some of the peak achievements were in Homestead, Pennsylvania, which really became a worker-run town, democratically worker-run town, beginning to take over mills and so on. And the reaction was brutal. This is the famous pacifist Andrew Carnegie took off on a trip to Scotland and had his manager, Frick, call in first security forces, the private security forces, Pinkertons, and the National Guard to just suppress it by violence. And it was 30, 40 years before Homestead began to emerge from anything but a company-run prison camp. In fact, famous Mother Jones tried to appear there, I think, during the First World War, just to speak. And she was driven out of town. You couldn't. It was people were afraid to talk. The reporters said it's like a prison. And in general, the history of American labor is extremely violent, and not violence by the workers, but violence by the owners and the security forces. Sometimes the state security forces, like National Guards, and sometimes private security forces, like the Pinkertons. In fact, that went on into the 1930s. I mean, in the late 1930s, workers were still getting killed here. Now, nothing like that was happening in Europe. In fact, the right-wing European press was appalled at the violence of the repression of working people in the United States, the right-wing press, the London Times and so on. And in fact, one of the worst offenders was Woodrow Wilson, great idealist, who launched, first of all, he put the leading labor leader, Eugene Debs, was just jailed for the impertinence of speaking to workers, saying that they should, if they're called into the army, they should consider their constitutional rights, and went to jail for that. And in fact, Wilson was so vindictive that around 1920, when he did declare an amnesty for the people who had been jailed for willingness to speak freely during the war, he made sure that Debs wasn't released. It took Warren Harding, the ultra-right president who followed him, to finally release Debs. He was not only the leading labor leader, but he was a presidential candidate, a major figure. But Wilson was extremely vindictive, and that Red Purge, as it was called, which really followed the war, had nothing to do with the war, drove thousands of people out of the country, anarchists, activists, and so on, and it was the harshest period of repression in American history. I mean, much worse than McCarthyism and so on. And it went on. I mean, by the 1920s, there had been a very vibrant and lively labor movement right through the late 19th century, but it was, there were places like Homestead where it was just crushed by force, and it was crushed. It arose again during the First World War, but Wilson pretty much crushed it. By the 1920s, it was almost gone. Owners and commentators were exulting about the end of history, capitalist utopia. David Montgomery, one of the main labor historians, has a book called The Rise and Fall of the American Labor Movement, and the fall is in the 1920s. It was essentially gone. Well, during the 1930s, it revived, and very significantly, and it got to the point of sit down. As I said, there was state violence and owner violence, but it got to the point where violence was no longer effective, and other techniques were devised to try to suppress labor rights and labor activism. Now, that's when what were called scientific methods of control of labor were devised. The scientific methods were mostly propaganda. The owners and the state recognized that violence has reached its limits. I mean, workers were at the point of almost taking over factories. That's what sit-down strikes are, which really strikes the fear of God into the ownership class, because that's just one step before taking over the factory. And they turned to these scientific methods, which are now a major industry. The standard technique was what was called at first the Mohawk Valley formula, which is where it was tried first. The idea was to go into a town where there was a strike brewing and spread massive propaganda through the media, the churches and civic groups, whatever you could, giving a picture of what was called Americanism. Americanism is we all live in harmony. We all work together. There's the loyal worker carrying his lunch pail, his wife preparing the meals, the friendly banker very eager to give everybody loans, the manager working 20 and 30 hours a day for the benefit of the workers, and we all live together in harmony, and it's Americanism. And then these outsiders come in, the union agitators, and they're trying to disrupt our harmony and spread poison and vilify people and so on. And we got to protect ourselves from the outside agitators. And that worked pretty well. I mean, these efforts were terminated by the war when there were other concerns. And during the war, there was massive labor organizing. But they were picked up again in the late 40s. And by the 1950s, just massive campaigns were launched to, the scale is incredible. There's pretty good scholarship on it, to take over everything, captive audiences in factories, sports leagues, churches, schools, were textbooks in schools, cinema, anything that could be reached was press, of course, to vilify unions and union leaders, particularly. They're all corrupt, thugs disrupting our harmony and so on and so forth. And it's not without effect. It's a major factor in the decline of unions, and destroying unions is extremely important, because that means they're one of the few ways in which ordinary people can get together, not only to try to achieve normal rights, like decent working conditions, wages, and so on, but also just to participate in a democratic process. If people are isolated, they are victims. There's very little that they can do to implement their own ideas, or even to know what their ideas are. You work these things out with other people, you organize to push them forward, and so on. And one of the results is sharp decline in industrial unions, but also a sharp decline in democracy. So our current form of democracy is one of passivity. Every 4 years, go to the polls and push a button, and you go home. Your opinions have almost nothing to do with policy. There's a huge gap between attitudes and policy, and that's the way it's supposed to be. A striking illustration. The propaganda was aimed at two things, really, primarily at unions. They're terrible because they're a democratizing force and they help working people, but also it was also aimed at democracy. You're supposed to hate the government. Actually, the business world has an ambivalent attitude towards government. It's a kind of love-hate relationship. They want the government to be very strong and powerful, but working for them. But they want everyone to hate it if it works for them. So you can see that pretty dramatically on April 15th, let's say. April 15th, when you pay your taxes, The attitude that's instilled in people is, it's kind of like a day of mourning. They, those outsiders, are stealing your hard-earned money, and you're forced to give it to them because nothing you can do about it. It's coercion from an alien force. Suppose we lived in a democracy. The attitude would be the opposite. In a democratic society, people would be cheering on April 15th. They say, here's the day when we all jointly contribute to carrying out the policies that we decided on. Well, that's democracy.